So anyways, babe.
Ugh, I hate everybody. Oh, look at those two. Must be the Beard of the Month Club. My beard is nice and white, but my beard is more bushy. Yay, let's be friends.
Recently, as I'm sure most of you are aware, there has been a lot of media attention regarding a bane plaguing our world, an odious specter that stalks city streets, dog parks, and Starbucks coffee shops. I'm speaking, of course, about Karen. Now, who is Karen, you ask? Well, this is Karen.
I don't need it. You can't put a sentence together? Sorry.
Okay.
That's pathetic.
Okay.
And you are a disappointment. And you are just following him. So you are also a disappointment.
This is Karen.
Your ass is grass.
Alright.
Do you understand?
Right.
And if
I'm
you
done with this shit.
so be looking out for those cops.
Alright, I will.
Get out of our
I'll be
neighborhood.
looking out
You're
for
supposed
those
to be
cops.
sheltered in place. Go ahead, put me on social media. You're a little pup.
And this is Karen.
If you want to be polite to the customer, then you speak English to the customer in America. Okay? My kids don't eat green things. They eat red peppers. You calm down.
This trend of middle-aged women whinging about rules that they themselves don't seem too keen to follow have been reveling in the era of the coof, wherein they get carte blanche opportunities to tell absolutely everyone around them how to behave, backed up by rules and regulations. This tendency to shame others is so prominent that even calling a Karen Karen will get one accused of using a slur. Of course, since the recent mega uh-oh that sparked protests and riots across the US and even other countries, the rules on social distancing have seemingly fallen by the wayside in terms of public concern. But while this pumpkin spice latte of a personality trait is still hot, I think it's time we talk about Karen and just what psychological tendencies and variables define the Karen mindset. But first, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, NordVPN. Nord is one of the top-rated VPNs on the market, voted best in 2020 by VPN Mentor, and I think it's a good idea just to give you guys a little bit of choice in your VPN. With more than 5,200 servers, Nord allows you to connect quickly, easily, and securely from almost anywhere to almost anywhere. This is a great tool for when your favorite movies or TV shows just aren't available in your region, but more importantly, Nord ensures your safety when browsing the net. With their double data encryption, your information is sure to stay secure. It works on Mac and PC, and you can even take it on the go with you on your Android or iOS devices. In these uncertain times, ensure your internet privacy by clicking the link in my description to get 70% off a 3-year plan with Nord. That's about $3.50 a month for security and peace of mind, all with a risk-free 30-day money-back guarantee. So keep your spicy internet usage private like I do when looking for great big hard R swear values by checking out NordVPN. So with that out of the way, and now that we have some proper protection, let's take a deep dive into Karen. I mean the Karen mindset. I'm sure many of you have witnessed Karen behavior of late, if not in person, hopefully, then perhaps online, as countless videos have recorded visual and audio evidence of the mythical screeching harpy. But are Karens a new thing, or have international tensions simply drawn them out of the woodwork? In this video, we're going to examine the Karen mindset, what causes it, who is prone to adopt it, and most of all, just what it is. So what is the Karen mindset, Aiden? I would argue it's a trait known as psychological entitlement. Entitlement was originally measured by social scientists as a subscale of the narcissistic personality inventory. However, over time, researchers came to question the subscale's validity, given that on its face, some items such as, quote, "if I ruled the world, it would be a better place," describe power-seeking or social dominance rather than entitlement. So just what is entitlement in comparison to narcissism? Psychological entitlement and narcissistic personality disorder are related variables, and entitlement, as I mentioned, once was a subscale of the narcissistic personality inventory. An easy way to conceptualize the difference between the two is via the onus of the trait. Narcissism is about the self and describes levels of self-esteem usually far above normal healthy degrees. In contrast, entitlement is about others. Entitled people may not always have high self-esteem and generally are more concerned with what others have that they don't. A narcissist believes that they are owed things because of their superiority over others, but an entitled person believes they are owed things simply because others possess them.
must be very proud.
No, not while my greatest nemesis still provides our customers with free light, heat, and energy. I call this enemy the sun.
If Karen is so entitled, then why do we so often hear that millennials are the excessively entitled ones? And is either one true? Has entitlement actually increased over time such that it's more prominent now than it was in the past? Well, data from Twenge et al. 2008 seem to be indicative that yes, at least in the United States, we are, or at least college students are, more narcissistic now than they were in the past, as narcissism has been on a strong upward trend since the 1980s on college campuses. Interestingly, the authors found that narcissism throughout the US rose much higher than it did in California universities. But the authors suggest that this trend is likely due to the large Asian American population in California universities, who comprise nearly half of incoming freshmen in 2007 at UC Berkeley, for example, as students from Asian backgrounds tend to be a little bit less narcissistic. Well, mostly less narcissistic.
I'm so glad we could admit Amy in exchange for your generous contribution.
How much more for Phi Beta Kappa?
How much you got?
This indicates, though, that there has been a general upward trend in psychological narcissism and entitlement then over the past few years in the United States. One variable that may affect who is high in entitlement is parenting style, as found by Giverts and Segrin 2012. They found a positive correlation between permissive parenting styles and psychological entitlement. Permissive parents are not demanding or directive. Instead, they are highly responsive and accepting of their children. Permissive parenting emphasizes leniency and children regulating their own behavior. Perhaps it comes as little surprise then that children of these parents are higher in entitlement. Entitlement was also related to parental control, which is just another way of saying overparenting. Overparenting is typified by excessive affection for the child and is usually the result of benevolent feelings, unaware of any potential downsides that this parenting style may elicit. Unsurprisingly, this type of parenting is also positively correlated with entitlement in children. What this all means is that, to a degree, entitled people are made, not born, and are a result, at least in part, of permissive parenting styles. Interestingly, permissive parenting style doesn't make anyone in the family unit really any happier, as it was found to be unrelated to family satisfaction. It's not a huge shocker that entitled kids may grow up to be entitled adults, given the often childlike behavior of Karens, but it's worth noting that this entitlement likely starts at an early age as a result, at least partially, of permissive overparenting, which ultimately leads to an unsatisfied family and entitled children. So thus far we've seen college students and certain parenting styles may produce people more prone to entitlement or narcissism. But what exactly does all that mean? Pryor, Miller, and Goggin 2008 examined similarities and differences between psychological entitlement and narcissistic personality traits and found the entitled to be generally more disagreeable, less warm, and have decreased levels of positive affect compared to narcissists. Moreover, entitled people are significantly lower in altruism and compliance than narcissists are, who are themselves low in those traits. Additionally, those with psychological entitlement may be more prone to certain mental health disorders, as they specifically displayed symptoms associated with schizoid and borderline personality disorder. Schizoid personality disorder is typified by preference for being alone and avoiding close personal relationships, but perhaps more apt for the Karen mindset, those with schizoid personality disorder may be humorless, emotionally cold, and have difficulty expressing situationally appropriate emotions. For clarity, schizoid personality disorder is distinct from schizophrenia, as those with schizotypal disorder, unlike those with schizophrenia, are cogent, not experiencing paranoia or hallucinations. In contrast, those with borderline personality disorder may experience intense paranoia, even losing contact with reality at times. BPD can also express itself in fits of intense anger and even physical altercations during their frequent mood swings that may result in dangerous, risk-taking behaviors. So Karen is just uniquely prone to being humorless, cold, but also furious and violent. This is not to say that everyone who is entitled has BPD or schizotypal disorder, but just to say that they may share some of these attributes.
Oh, thank you for making time in your busy life to come in here and get in the way of mine.
Anya, play nice.
Just to make the comparison to the Karen mindset clear, let's play a little game of bingo with the symptoms of these two mental disorders and the behaviors of a typical Karen. With the symptoms of borderline from the DSM-V being 1. Frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, 2. A pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation, 3. Identity disturbance, marked and persistently unstable self-image and sense of self, 4. Impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, for example, spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, or binge eating. 5. Recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, or self-mutilating behavior. 6. Affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood, for example, intense episodic dysphoria, irritability, or anxiety, usually lasting a few hours and only rarely more than a few days. 7. Chronic feelings of emptiness. 8. Inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger, for example, frequent displays of temper, constant anger, or reoccurring physical fights. And 9. Transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. Now, pull out a second bingo sheet for schizoid personality disorder, and let's again play along with the symptoms from the DSM-V. 1. Neither desires nor enjoys close personal relationships, including being part of a family. 2. Almost always chooses solitary activities. 3. Has little, if any, interest in having sexual experiences with another person. 4. Takes pleasure in few, if any, activities. 5. Lacks close friends or confidence other than first-degree relatives. 6. Appears indifferent to praise or criticism of others. And 7. Shows emotional coldness, detachment, or flattened affectivity. While, again, I'm not saying that every person who displays a Karen-type mentality has a personality disorder, not in the least, I am saying that the common behavior we see from Karens is similar in some ways to borderline and schizoid personality disorders, as well as a narcissistic personality. Given the close link, particularly to narcissism and entitlement, we seemingly are starting to describe that thing, the Karen mindset. Since I keep referring to this phenomenon as the Karen mindset, are there gender differences then between men and women when it concerns entitlement? Is there any reason to believe entitlement or narcissism might overwhelmingly affect women over men? Well, let's go through the 3 facets of narcissism and see if there are any gender differences. Grijalva et al. 2015, in a meta-analysis of 355 studies, examined gender differences in narcissism, and while they found that men were more likely to possess grandiose narcissism, there was no difference between the sexes in vulnerable narcissism, being equally prevalent in men and women. Grandiose narcissism is positively related to extroversion and social dominance, as well as exhibitionism and aggression, while vulnerable narcissism is associated with low subjective well-being, anxiety, introversion, and generally low self-confidence. Perhaps the reason we've seen such an increase in ravenous Karen sightings of late is because of the association of vulnerable narcissism with anxiety and a lack of well-being. Thus, while these traits aren't more common in women, they may present differently. Instead, narcissism may describe a male version of Karen. We'll call him Darren. Given that narcissism seems to be more prolific in men than in women, when combined with a connection between narcissism and entitlement though, perhaps we can start to paint a picture of the Karen mindset, which is related to narcissism, but still a distinct construct. Other gender differences were noted by Rose and Anastasio 2014, who examined correlates of narcissism and entitlement. Narcissism was unrelated to sociotropy, that is, dependence on others. Unlike narcissism, entitlement involves others rather than being more self-oriented as narcissism seems to typify. Further, sociotropy was more common in women than in men, while autonomy was more common in men than in women. This indicates that while entitlement may be equally common for both sexes, it's expressed differently, with women relying more on others doing things for them to prop up their sense of entitlement, while the same sense is autonomous and self-oriented in men. Specifically, entitlement was not related to the aspect of sociotropy that involved pleasing others, but was positively related to concern for what others think, as well as dependency on others. That is, entitled people may be more prone to put on a show of sorts, because they're concerned with the opinions of others and rely on others to get what they want. In contrast, narcissism, which is again more common in males, is often unconcerned with the opinions of others. Entitlement gains its powers from others through demands, and the entitled person being treated specially. When someone, well, not just someone, let's be clear here, when Karen films her own public meltdown and posts it to Facebook, it's her sense of entitlement that's driving that behavior because she wants other people to see it and defend said behavior.
Because you're discriminating against me now, do you know that? You're discriminating against me.
She's dependent on getting that feedback from others. Narcissists, on the other hand, don't care so much what others think or do, while for entitled people, getting what they want from others is key. Further experiments from Anastasio and Rose found that while entitled men tended to not endorse female equality and instead opposed it, entitled women themselves also weren't super on board with equality for women.
How is prostitution illegal, but alimony isn't? They're basically the same thing. You're paying for the whore to leave.
This does make sense though, as entitled people want the lion's share of anything and everything, be it equal rights or the last roll of TP at the supermarket. Thus, entitled women don't want their competition in the sexual marketplace to have any advantages, and entitled men may feel that they're owed the attention of women, and thus have negative opinions towards gender parity as well. This indicates that while Karen may be quick to use her gender to her advantage, she doesn't support feminism in general, only when it benefits herself. This intergroup effect also seemingly applies to racial groups, as entitlement in white participants predicted some anti-black bias, with more entitled participants agreeing more with statements such as, quote, "blacks are getting too demanding in their push for civil rights." What this means is that entitlement seems to have in-group preference effects in some instances, but not so much in others. A big takeaway when concerning Karen, however, is that she's unlikely to support other women out of gender solidarity, and instead is going to be exclusively focused on herself. To further understand the interplay of gender, entitlement, and behavior, we can look to Xline and Zell 2009, who asked men and women to think about a time in their lives when they felt deeply hurt or offended, and then were assigned to one of 4 experimental conditions. These conditions included thinking about a time when he or she had committed a similar harmful offense against someone else, thinking about how that person who offended him or her might have felt by taking their perspective, considering a time when he or she felt positively about the self, or reflect back on what a typical week was like for him or her 1 year in the past. Women reported feeling angry when thinking about a similar offense or taking the perspective of someone who had offended them, while the same was not the case for men. Men reported feeling positive emotions, sadness, and strength in response to these prompts, but not anger, which was exclusive in statistical significance to women. For women, a sense of entitlement was related to vengefulness and negatively related to benevolence after thinking about a time when she was hurt or offended. Again, this was not the case for men, whose entitlement was related to feelings of avoidance when remembering a similar incident. And while men and women's entitlement were both related to hostility, the statistical significance was weak here. In summation, when women feel wronged, they are likely to be angrier than men, and when women feel entitled, they are also likely to be more vengeful compared to men. In other words, hoes mad.
Hoes mad, hoes mad, hoes mad.
Thus far, we've seen that Karen is high in entitlement, and that along with that comes symptoms reminiscent of schizoid and borderline personality disorders, as well as high amounts of anger, hostility, and unforgivingness. Yet we haven't seen any strong gender differences that would make Karen more common than Darren. So why do we seemingly have an inundation of women with this mindset rather than a more even gender split? Well, perhaps it's because entitled men and women simply behave differently. Because as Hammond, Sibley, and Overall 2013 found, women may like the treatment their entitled behavior elicits because it awards them some degree of social benefit. Over the course of a year, women and men were asked about their opinions on benevolent sexism towards women, believing they are special and should be cherished. When first asked, both men and women high in entitlement felt that women deserved to be given special treatment. But interestingly, men were more likely to feel this way regardless of their own sense of entitlement. Women low in entitlement, in fact, felt the lowest amount of benevolent sexism. A year later, when polled again, men's opinions had changed, with high entitlement men no longer promoting benevolent sexism towards women, but men low in entitlement now backing women as deserving special treatment. This seems to be evidence of a kind of simp cycle, if you will.
It goes like this: soy boy, cuck, simp. You're the lowest of the low. I'm sorry, I don't make the rules.
Women high in entitlement remain adamant over time that they should be treated as uniquely valuable, but while men who were high in entitlement initially agreed, over time they stopped simping, and that role was taken up by men low in entitlement. Further data from Grubbs, Exline, and Twang, 2014, in a series of experiments, examined entitlement and sexism, both hostile and benevolent, and found that entitled women also ascribed to benevolent sexism for women, believing women deserve special treatment. Interestingly, a portion of women also believed in hostile sexism towards women, but this may be an externalization, believing other women don't deserve special treatment, but she, the respondent, does. In general, though, entitlement was related to benevolent sexism towards women by women. Meanwhile, in men, entitlement was related to hostile sexism.
And just because my sex organs are on the inside instead of the outside doesn't mean that I can't handle.
To summarize these findings, Chads often don't respect women, while Karens respect themselves, but not necessarily other women as well. So are entitled women on board with girl power across the board then? Not necessarily, as data from Anastasio and Rose 2014 illustrated across a series of studies. While Hammond et al. Seemingly found support for benevolent sexism, these data indicated no preference for one's in-group. That is, the favoritism found in Hammond et al.'s data were not replicated in Anastasio and Rose, meaning that the true benevolence likely applies only to the self and not to members of their shared social group, women. That is, entitled women think they deserve the benefits of benevolent sexism, but other women do not. In an additional study, entitled women showed no preference for lesbian women in terms of liking them or equality, while entitled men actively rated lesbians less favorably than gay men.
Let no lesbian feel discriminated against, black or white, man or woman.
This indicates that there may still be some in-group preference for one's own gender in men, but again, not in women, who seem to view other women as a threat, at least when those women are presumably straight, with ambivalence towards women who are lesbians. Again, this all seems to exemplify the Karen mindset, as Karen, who we know tends to be entitled, may be more likely to be vengeful and unforgiving while lacking in benevolence towards others. Men simply don't seem as prone to the same emotions and behaviors that Karen is. So is being a Karen unique to women? No. And in terms of narcissism, men typically have women beat, while entitlement is about even in its prevalence across men and women. I've been calling it the Karen mindset for a reason, because while entitled women may be more vengeful, cattier towards other women, and generally more concerned with others rather than the self, all of these things relate to entitlement, which, as I mentioned, is split relatively evenly across the sexes. That is, both men and women can be Karens, entitled, concerned with others rather than preoccupation solely on the self, and generally vengeful and unpleasant social annoyances. But what else typifies the Karen mindset in terms of its correlates? One thing that seems unique to the Karen mindset is that there's always, or at least frequently, a camera involved in capturing the incidents of peak Karenism. Oftentimes it's others filming, but seemingly just as frequently it's Karen herself holding the camera. Whether or not others are watching the behavior of entitled people seems to make a difference in that behavior, as represented in data from Holderness, Olson, and Thornnock, 2016. In this study, participants were asked to complete a series of mazes and were told either that no one was watching their actions or that they were being monitored. Those high in entitlement completed the mazes when they thought they weren't being watched much more slowly than those who were unentitled. However, when they believed they were being watched, the entitled completed the task much more expediently, so much so as to outpace those low in entitlement. This again indicates that entitled people behave differently when they are being watched and may put on a show for the cameras, or even just for bystanders of their behavior. This seems to be the case as participants high in entitlement did not just perform faster, they performed better, completing the mazes often more correctly than when they did not think they were being watched. Thus, entitled people don't just put on a show, they put on a good show when the attention of others is placing them in the spotlight. While not being monitored, those same high entitlement people will perform slowly and inaccurately. In contrast, when the camera's on them, the entitled people will likely perform for the camera.
Dude, this is just weird.
This is what I do. I just talk into the camera.
Are you kidding me? You never do this. You have all these colors on your face. Your mouth is going like,
But we don't need to just stop there when looking at the psychological and personality correlates of narcissism and entitlement. Looking at Campbell et al. 2004, in development of their own measure of entitlement, they found that entitlement related to numerous other variables across a series of studies. In terms of the Big Five personality traits, entitlement and narcissism were negatively related to agreeableness, and entitlement was negatively related to emotional stability. Again, here strong correlations between narcissism and entitlement were present, unsurprising as the narcissism instrument again contains a subscale of entitlement. One study within this set found that those high in entitlement were more prone to actually take candy from babies. Well, sort of. After filling out a questionnaire measuring their entitlement and narcissism, participants were told they could take as much candy as they wanted from a bucket labeled with a post-it note saying it was for the child psychology lab. So maybe not directly taking candy from babies, but a similar act nonetheless. And unsurprisingly, those higher in entitlement took more candy than those low in entitlement. Entitled participants also suggested that they should earn higher salaries than others when given a prompt which asked them to imagine working for a company making salary cuts. Thus, presumably, giving themselves a higher salary would necessitate lower salaries or the firing of other employees. Those high in entitlement may often also act with reckless abandon, as an additional experiment found entitled participants were more likely to harvest trees for their own profit to the point of deforestation and without concern for the environment. Finally, participants wrote a short essay on a non-controversial topic and then received positive or negative feedback. Next, in an unrelated test, participants were told they would be competing against a different person in a guessing game, wherein the loser would be subjected to a loud noise. Of course, there was no other player, and the true interest was in assessing participants' aggression based on their recommended decibel level that they believed their opponent would hear if they lost. Those high in entitlement, who also received negative feedback, cranked the volume up on their partner to a potentially painful degree.
Shut the f*** up!
Taken all together, the entitled are rude, aggressive, reckless, greedy, and selfish. And applied to Karen, again, this behavior starts to make some sense, or at least fall into an understandable category of narcissism and entitlement. Karen will sacrifice other people's jobs or even the environment that we are all forced to share with her, so long as she gets something out of it all. Remember, we're talking about people willing to take candy from babies.
Everything I know about people, I learned from pens. If they don't work, you shake them. If they still don't work, you chuck them away, beat them!
Campbell et al.'s series of studies also looked at gender differences. However, there were few of them between men and women, and when there were alternative explanations, as men suggested giving themselves higher salaries than women, but men typically do earn more than women. And this isn't the right time to go off on a tangent about the wage gap, but this finding may simply be a result of men typically working more hours than women do, and often in more physically demanding jobs. Besides, we've already covered the most relevant findings on gender. Additionally, and unsurprisingly, entitlement was not seen as socially desirable, hence why many people have been cataloging the Karen crisis of late, because we all kind of know that this stuff is not acceptable. But it doesn't appear to hinder Karen, who already has such a strong sense of entitlement and potentially even some narcissism, which again seem to be closely linked, as to not care what anyone else thinks about her. So let's look more into narcissism and its correlates to see if we can better understand the Karen mindset. Paulhus and Williams 2002 looked at the Big Five personality traits in relationship with dark triad personality traits, which include narcissism, accompanied by Machiavellianism, which is strategic exploitation and deceit, as well as psychopathy, which is callousness or cynicism. All three of the dark triad traits were negatively related to agreeableness, which again was also negatively related to entitlement. Narcissism and psychopathy were both positively related to extroversion and openness, which makes sense in relationship to Karen, who does not shy away from giving her opinions about the behaviors of others quite publicly. This connection is also interesting because openness is a personality trait often associated with liberalism rather than conservatism. And looking at the work of Hirsch et al., and yes, the Peterson and the et al. Here is Jordan B., 2010.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer.
Who found negative correlations between openness and the moral foundations of authority and purity, means that some of the traits that define Karen also define liberalism. conservatives tend to be high in conscientiousness, while liberals tend to be high on agreeableness and openness. And while there is a strong negative relationship between narcissism and entitlement and agreeableness, there is also a strong negative relationship between openness and typical conservative traits of concern for authority and purity. Looking specifically to Sibley, Osborne, and Duckett 2012, agreeableness was negatively associated with conservatism in general, while conscientiousness was positively related to conservatism. In Hirsch et al., agreeableness had two components: compassion, which was associated with leftist political views, and politeness, which was associated with the right. But since the Karen mindset is disagreeable, the whole factor of agreeableness is a bit of a wash. Ackerman and Donnellan, 2013, further correlated entitlement to numerous other personality variables. Measures of entitlement were negatively correlated with various dimensions of agreeableness and conscientiousness, as well as openness. In contrast, entitlement was positively correlated with aspects of neuroticism and extroversion. While Sibley et al. Found no strong political leaning for extroversion, neuroticism tends to lean left, as does openness. Entitlement, then, isn't a trait that typifies the right or the left of the political aisle. Both sides can be high in entitlement. This means that Karen may tend to lean left in terms of openness to experience, but she's also just a disagreeable person, which may mean she actually tends to lean towards the center politically. With this all in mind, just what kind of outcomes can entitlement entail, and under what circumstances may one act more entitled? So far, we've talked a lot about what the Karen mindset is and who might be affected by it. But what are the outcomes, social or otherwise, of being a Karen? Let's start by looking at entitlement again, as we know it often describes what we're dealing with when we're dealing with the Karen mindset. Zitek et al. 2010 examined entitlement across a series of studies in relationship with selfish behavior. In the first experiment, participants were asked to think about a time when he or she was treated unfairly, and then were given an option to help the experimenter out with another project by answering a short, unrelated survey. Those who were prompted to think about a time that they were treated unfairly felt more entitled and subsequently were less likely to help the experimenter out with their request. In an additional experiment, participants again were told to think about a time when they were wronged, and then were given an opportunity to take some candy from a bucket labeled for participants, with only 11 pieces left and 2 empty wrappers sitting on the table. While surprisingly, people who thought about being wronged and were subsequently more likely to feel entitled did not take more candy, they were more likely to engage in other selfish actions, including stealing the pen, leaving trash on the table, and in one case even knocking over the sign and not picking it back up. Wow, what an absolute Karen. The point is, those who felt entitled, after thinking about a time they were wronged, were more likely to engage in some form of selfish behavior.
Chandler, you have to find the line between stealing and taking what the hotel owes you. For example, a hairdryer, no. But shampoos and conditioners, oh yes.
In a final experiment, participants were asked to find specific letters in a puzzle containing many letters within 15 seconds and were given either seemingly fair or unfair opportunity to complete the task. In the fair condition, the puzzle was massive and one letter was missing, but due to the size of the puzzle, there wasn't enough time to have thoroughly searched for the letter. Yeah, I know, that's unfair, one letter was missing, so how can that be the fair condition? Well, because in the unfair condition, the puzzle was small, did contain all the letters, but would not allow the user to click on every letter in the last instance, with the program then crashing. See, now the first one sounds really fair in comparison, right? Anyway, after failing to complete the task, participants were asked how much money they should receive if they were to redo the puzzle in competition versus another person. Participants were also told that they finished the task 70% faster than other participants, so an argument could be made that they should receive more money with a total of $6 to split between the two participants. Those in the unfair condition, where the program crashed, believed they deserved more money, by an average of 29 cents more than their potential competitor. In the fair loss condition, only 8% of participants said they should get more money. Those who felt the game was unfair scored higher on psychological entitlement and were generally also angrier and more frustrated than if they thought they had just run out of time. Taken together, these studies indicate that when people feel something is unfair, they're also more likely to feel entitled. When applied to the case of Karen, this makes a lot of sense, as the slightest perceived slight can elicit feelings of unfairness, and with that comes anger and frustration, so often taken out on innocent bystanding hourly workers who happen to be caught in Karen's wailing wake.
But you know, Baldric, the world isn't fair. If it was, things like this wouldn't happen, would they?
Given that psychological entitlement is related to feelings of unfairness over often minimal problems, it's unsurprising that it would cause issues in the workplace. Harvey and Martinko 2009 surveyed workers in a variety of professions and found that psychological entitlement was actually related negatively to the need for cognition, which is a trait that describes people who like to think about things for the sake of thinking about things. In other words, the entitled don't like to have too much of a big thunk about anything, both directly and indirectly through that decreased need for cognition then. Entitlement was related to self-attribution, which is a tendency to believe that the self is responsible for external events, and in the case of the entitled, that typically means positive outcomes are believed to be due to one's own actions, not due to anyone else's. Self-attribution as a product of entitlement, then, was negatively related to job satisfaction and positively related to conflict with the manager. Entitlement was also directly related positively to intentions to quit one's job.
You want to see the manager?
Yeah.
Yeah? I'll show you the manager. Here's the man. Right here. Here's the manager. You want to talk to him? What should I do? Throw him out!
What this all means is that entitled people tend to dislike their jobs, want to quit, and quarrel with managers. So therefore, the typical Karen often has problems not just with employees, but with employers as well, even her own manager. So thus far, I probably haven't painted the prettiest picture of Karen, have I? But don't worry, it gets worse. Zitek and Jordan 2019 conducted a series of studies examining the relationship between entitlement and the ability to follow instructions. In their first experiment, participants were given specific instructions about how to complete a word search puzzle and found that people higher in entitlement were less likely to follow the precise rules. In the second study, participants were given vignettes wherein they were asked to think about a task they might have to perform for their professor, such as using a new citation style. Once again, entitled people were less likely to report being willing to do any extra work even for this minor task, illustrative that the decision to not follow orders is a kind of act of entitled rebellion was examined in a third study, which replicated the first, but instead of giving participants a set of rules to follow, some were given, instead, a set of suggestions on how to complete the word puzzle. Once again, the more entitled one was, the more likely he or she was to ignore the instructions. Whether or not the instructions were optional had no significant effect on propensity to follow or ignore the rules. Those high in entitlement were equally as likely to ignore the rules given as a hard line of restrictions or just as a list of suggestions. In total, this means that those high in psychological entitlement are unwilling to follow the rules, something we've seen with some frequency when again it comes to wearing face masks, or really whenever Karen is given any kind of instructions.
I am disoriented. I'm a little mad.
Given the nastiness so many Karens seem to possess, are they psychologically less well off than others who may be a little bit more stable?
Mad.
Zemostopiotroska et al. 2013 first defined active, passive, and revengeful types of entitlement, with active entitlement being a focus on the self and ensuring self-promotion, passive entitlement being a belief that the government or society should take care of its people, and revengeful entitlement being difficulty in forgiving perceived insults. In their sample of Polish participants, active entitlement was positively related to materialism and subjective well-being. Passive entitlement was positively related to materialism only when the passively entitled person was low in subjective well-being. Finally, revengeful entitlement was negatively related to subjective well-being and positively related to materialism. Taken all together, people low in subjective well-being, that is, having a positive evaluation on one's life, may believe that the problems they face are an unfair product of society, which makes some sense when we look at Karen. Her problems are not due to any fault of her own, but rather the result of others' actions or inaction, a violation of her passive entitlement. As passive entitlement increases, so too does materialism. So not only is Karen low in subjective well-being and likely unhappy, she's also probably highly materialistic. This means that Karen is probably always having a bad day, no matter how much frivolous shopping she gets to do in it.
We found out that you could just, buy psychological validation.
Another study from Zemotel Piotrowska et al. 2015 examined narcissism and entitlement again in comparison to subjective well-being and self-esteem. Again, narcissism and entitlement were strongly related variables, but being entitled or narcissistic does not necessarily make one happier with one's life. Narcissism was positively, but only slightly related to satisfaction with life, while entitlement was negatively related to that satisfaction. Despite this, both narcissism and entitlement were positively related to self-esteem. That is, narcissistic and entitled people like themselves quite a lot and have high opinions of themselves or their skills or traits, but ultimately, they aren't very satisfied with their lives. Again, it seems all the threads are starting to come together into the tapestry that is Karen. She may be extremely entitled and believe her shit truly does not stink, yet at the same time is unlikely to be satisfied with her life. She's angry and unforgiving, and when you take a look at her average behavior, it seems so obvious as to almost not be worth saying that Karen is an unhappy person. But we have to back up everything that's so seemingly obvious with data. And finally, we need to know what it is that's so special about times of crisis that produce the prevalence of Karens we've seen. And answers may lie in the research of Murray, Schaller, and Sudfeld, 2013, who examined authoritarian attitudes during an epidemic. As we've seen, Karen often wants to control others or have what others possess out of a sense of entitlement. But could there be a darker side to that behavior? As usual with Karen, seems like it. As when a disease was more prominent, support for an authoritarian government increased across 31 countries. In terms of individual support for authoritarianism, this propensity accounted for 77% of the total effect of pathogen prevalence on political rights. Stress related to the pathogen and its prevalence in society were both positively related to authoritarian governance. Further, disease was a unique variable in its effects on individual facets of authoritarianism. Unlike other crises, including malnutrition and warfare, and to a lesser degree famine, disease seems to produce authoritarian attitudes and behaviors. Apart from leadership selection bias, diseases were positively related to all other aspects of authoritarianism, including a lack of checks and balances for leaders' power, more power for leaders, and formal enforcement of their decisions. In addition to entitlement and all that comes with it, when combined with a public health crisis, many of those entitled people are likely to turn authoritarian. So not only is Karen entitled, she likely thinks that she should have or does have political power to back up that entitlement. And with all that in mind, let's come to some conclusions. Today we've taken a far closer look at Karen than I'm sure her layers of foundation to cover up those angry veins would like us to. So who is Karen and what's her seeming beef with everyone else on the planet? Karen is someone high in psychological entitlement, meaning she may not have the highest self-esteem, but she believes she's owed certain things in life simply because others possess them. It's an existence typified by jealousy and envy of others. Karen isn't necessarily a woman, as both sexes can be prone to this behavior of vengefulness and entitlement, and she's so self-absorbed she'll literally take candy from babies or blast a loud noise in the ears of a competitor. Anything to preserve her feelings of superiority over others and her sense of deservedness of special treatment. Karen doesn't like being told what to do and may lash out when given rules or restrictions. Despite all of this, Karen is probably not a very happy person satisfied with her life. Thus, perhaps we should not hate Karen for being an insufferable wench, but instead pity her, because perhaps there's no one who dislikes Karen more than she herself does. Well, maybe. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you're interested in helping out the channel, consider clicking the link and signing up for NordVPN in the description. Also consider checking out Concordia Recordings for providing the background music to this video. As always, thank you guys for listening to this long video, and as always, dear friends, all ton of volts.